Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us in the August First Friday webinar. We're very excited to have Chris Mueller from Beta Theta Pi from the national headquarters. Chris prefers to use the pronouns he, him, and his. And this presentation will be looking at a new way of thinking about roommate conflicts. Here you go. Chris?
All right, so I guess I'm live now. This is my first experience with Google Hangout, so that's a lot of fun for me. Thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to share this information and to enlighten you all as to a new way to think about conflict and hopefully provide some information that's going to make dealing with conflict, specifically amongst roommates, a little bit easier. So as we move through the presentation and you have questions, you can go ahead and put those in the chat function, or you can save them for later. I'll try to entertain as many of them as possible as we move through to make sure that we get all those answered. So the title of the presentation is That Half of the Room is Yours, and I think that's really telling to how I came about doing a lot of research and reading and writing on this topic. Is that I would find all of these students throughout my time in housing that would think of their rooms as divisible, and they could divide up into little chunks and pieces, and that would make their lives awesome. So that was one of the questions and one of the things that struck me as strange as I went through, because I never had that experience when I was in college. So a little bit of background on the presentation, just so I can further vet myself as someone that knows what they're talking about. I did spend 5 years working in housing at Kansas State University, so shout out to all of my Wildcats out there. Now I have the good fortune and pleasure of working for Beta Theta Pi at their national headquarters in Oxford, Ohio, as the Associate Director of Leadership and Education. So I do a lot of programming and curriculum writing for our leadership programs that are done across the country for our undergraduate members. So a couple of other things I wanted to provide you before we get started is that a lot of the information you're going to hear in this presentation is not going to be news. A lot of it is probably going to be things that you've either heard of or that you've read or that maybe you even knew already, and that's okay. I'm not going to probably provide you anything that's going to be earth-shattering, but what I want to provide you is a different way to think about some common things that we deal with as we're dealing with college students in general, but specifically dealing with college students that live with each other that may have never met each other before. So, and I do recognize that the bulk of the research that was done on this topic for this presentation has a cultural bias. We're looking at students in the United States, in a Midwest town, at a larger university. So a lot of the information that I provide that shapes the research that I did does have that cultural bias. I do recognize that it was done in an individualistic culture. So keep that in mind as we move through, that if you're working with international students or you're working with those that come from different cultures, like a collectivist culture, they think about conflict differently. So some of this stuff may not play quite as nicely. So knowing that and knowing that that's where we are, we're going to go ahead and get started. So our objectives here today, or the takeaways, is we're going to learn a little theory. Everyone loves theory. We're going to define what an engaged system versus a coexistent system is. Again, we're taking a systems approach and thinking about conflict. And then we will identify the resources and how to use them. And we'll talk a little bit more about what resources are and what I mean by that. So when you talk about conflict, one of the first things you need to do is define it, because conflict has many meanings to many people, and most of our students think about it in this way. If you've never seen this graphic before, it's a great one, and I encourage you to go find it. There's some other panels to this cartoon that are more horrifying, but as you talk to students, this is the way they think about conflict. The entire place is burning down around them, and they are just sitting there pretending that everything's okay. And some adults think about it this way too. Think about the last conflict that you were in, and did you know that something was wrong? And if you did know something was wrong, did you do anything to stop it? So knowing that this is the way that most of our students think about conflict shapes a lot of our responses to it, we first have to get them to understand that something might be the matter, and they may need to move forward in taking some action. So knowing that we need to do that, I think it's important that we all work from the same idea of what conflict is. There's many, many different definitions. This definition that I came up with is a combination of a lot of different ones, and I think it really encapsulates how our students think of conflict when they come to universities and colleges. So as you can see there, it's an interactive process that's manifested in perceived incompatibility, disagreement, or dissonance within or between interdependent social entities. That's a combination of some definitions from those authors there. This definition shapes and has shaped all of the research that I have done in regards to conflict and systems approach using structuration. So again, this is several definitions that are all kind of married together, but I think it's important for us to start from the same place, because depending on what you're reading and who wrote it, they have a very different idea of what conflict is and how it should look. I also recognize that that is a lot of words and can be somewhat confusing to folks that aren't as inundated with conflict research and reading as some other folks. So I want to break that down to be just plainer and simpler terms. So when we talk about conflict and we talk about that definition, I want to break it down into the 4 parts. So it's an interactive process, which means that folks are interdependent. So they're interdependent social entities. They need each other. That's the reason conflict happens between students, is that they need each other. If you really want to watch a student, or really anybody's head explode, tell them that the reason they're having a conflict is because they actually need the other person. And I think that they'll first try to correct you and say, "Nuh-uh, I don't need them. I don't even like them." And then you can move on further by saying, well, you wouldn't have a conflict if you could just walk away from that. And I found that to be true in a lot of the roommate relationships, is that they didn't want to talk to each other, but in order for them to exist in that space and have them not kill one another, they needed to have some level of understanding. So that's the first part of this definition. Plain and simple, folks need each other. The second part of that conflict is that, again, it's interactive, it's reciprocal. For every action, there's an equal or somewhat non-equal and opposite reaction. So if somebody does something that the other person doesn't like, usually there's a retaliatory response or some sort of reciprocation that, again, builds on that interactive process. Another important part of that definition is that it's perceived incompatibility, disagreement, or dissonance. Perceptions are really, really powerful when you're dealing with interpersonal relationships, especially in conflict. I'm sure that some of you out there have had the nothing fight before. And the nothing fight is what I like to call the type of argument where absolutely nothing could be wrong between the parties that are involved. But the simple fact that someone feels some dissonance or feels like something might be the matter can be enough to cause a conflict. So how folks perceive one another in a relationship, how folks perceive each other through a conflict can really color how they handle that specific interaction and what the interactions subsequent after look like. So again, perceptions are what we're working with. It's difficult to navigate perceptions. So when we go into our mediations, a lot of times it's spent clarifying what people think of one another. And then finally, I think that a really important part when you're talking about roommates specifically is that this is a long-term relationship with a fixed endpoint. And I would challenge folks to think about other relationships in their lives that have fixed endpoints. How many other relationships can you think of where you can actually point on a calendar and say, this is when that relationship ends? There are a few others, but they're very rare. Even when you look at an employer, there's not like a fixed endpoint that we can point to typically, unless you're a student that's going back to college and you know exactly when you need to leave. You know, we think about romantic relationships, we think about friendships. These are not the type of relationship where we can point to when it's going to end. But a roommate relationship, I can move in on August 17th into my residence hall room or into my apartment, and I can know that on May 25th, I'm out of there and I don't ever have to talk to you again. Or it could be even sooner. Maybe you're only there for a semester or for a quarter or for a trimester for folks that are on those systems. So that can complicate this relationship because it adds to that avoidance behavior. Folks don't have to talk to one another if they know they just have to make it to a certain endpoint. So those 4 aspects of this relationship are really what I want you to remember, is that when we talk about conflict, and specifically with roommates, it's interdependent, so they need each other. They're going to be reciprocal about the way they interact. they are dealing primarily with perceptions and how they perceive one another, and that it's a long-term relationship with a fixed endpoint, which makes it that much more difficult to sometimes navigate. So in order to handle that definition of conflict with those aspects of it, I chose a very difficult to understand joke-implied theory, which is a communication studies theory. It's based in organizational communication, and it's structuration theory. And I'm going to take the next few minutes and explain structuration and how I used it to color the research that I did. Structuration theory is, again, a theory that deals with social systems, and that these systems are comprised of practices. These practices exist through rules and resources, and the rules and resources structure practices that produce and reproduce the system. So it's a very iterative and repetitive process when we talk about structuration theory. And when we talk about rules, a rule can be any routine or any tool that guides your action. And then a resource can be physical or non-physical, and it can be harnessed to act out a rule. I'll give you an example of rules and resources later on that I think will be fairly easy for my folks to understand. So again, dealing with conflict, looking at structuration theory. If you needed a visual of what structuration theory looked like, and most of us are like, what does that mean? I have no idea. But I found a very easy way to explain that, because after I looked at that graph, I felt like this. And that was all the way through doing all of my research. All I could figure out was that this is what represented the theory, and that just didn't work for me. So I had to work in a new graph, and this is what I found. So when we talk about structuration, you have a social practice. You have the structure that informs the action, and you have the action that reinforces the structure. So I'm going to take a minute and I'm going to explain how structuration theory works, so that in an everyday example, so that we can talk a little bit more about how this colored my experience with conflict. So we're going to use ducks, so these little duckies here. So let's imagine you are standing, we're student affairs professionals, right? So we run on coffee. Coffee is what we need. So let's pretend that these ducks are going to get some coffee, and they're going to go to the Starbucks or the local coffee shop, what have you, and that's where they're going to get their coffee. Now, I encourage you to think very carefully about this. What do you do when you go into a Starbucks typically? Do you walk right up to the counter and order your drink, or is there usually some other people that are in that store? And it doesn't have to be coffee if that's not your jam, but any service that you go to provide, but we're going to stick with coffee. So when you walk into that Starbucks, you've got a line typically. Now I encourage you to think, how long did it take you to understand that you need to stand in a line if you want a service? From a very young age, we figure that out. We're socialized to understand that there's somebody that's selling something or somebody that has something that I want. There are other people that want it too. And in order for me to get it, I need to stand in this line until I get up to the person. That's a social practice that doesn't typically take much teaching. A couple of times when we're young, but then we just kind of catch on and we keep doing it. Right? Does anyone have to come up to you and remind you to stand in a line when you're trying to get coffee from Starbucks, or when you're trying to go on a roller coaster at an amusement park? Typically not. That's just something that we do naturally. So imagine these ducks are standing in line to get some coffee at Starbucks, right? So we're going to name this one construction and this one space, because they're, construction worker in space. So space is at the front of the line and construction workers at the back of the line. So if construction worker were to say, I'm done with this, this isn't what it's all quacked up to be, and he decides to cut space duck in the line, space duck and everybody behind him are going to correct construction duck and say, hey, you can't cut in that line. If you want your coffee, you need to stand in line like the rest of us. Okay, so there's a social practice here of standing in a line to get a service. The action that we are using is to stand in that line. The structure is the actual understanding of we stand in lines when we want stuff. So by standing in this line, we're actually reinforcing the social practice that lines are what we utilize to get to places. So by doing this, we teach continually that this is what we do. If construction duck cuts, even trying to circumvent that social practice, like I'm not going to do this anymore, I'm not going to stand in this line, the system and the social practice is so ingrained that everyone that's standing in that line is going to correct him and say, no, you go to the back of the line, right? Not even right where you were, you go all the way to the back of the line. So by trying to get out of that system, by trying to break those rules, even then, we have a galvanizing force, and we continue to reinforce those rules. So not even trying to get out of it, can we not reinforce those rules? That seems like probably a weird way to teach that, but it's when I presented this live, I've had people stand up and demonstrate that, and I thought ducks are a great tool in place of live human beings. So when we talk about structuration theory, that's what we're talking about: the social practices and the actions that we use to reinforce those social practices. And I thought, well, that's pretty interesting. That's a pretty fascinating thing to think about, this idea that there are social systems that we utilize and practices that we partake in to galvanize and continue to reinforce those social practices. How can this be applied to conflict? Because quite honestly, I read this and that was awesome, but I thought, you know, that's great. What do we do with it now? So I came up with two questions. I wanted to know, how does the system influence a student's approach to conflict? Is there a system that is coloring their idea of how we go through and handle conflict? And if so, how does it influence the student's approach? And then what are the rules and the resources that help that student to understand how they are supposed to navigate through a conflict? And what I found were some really fascinating results. I interviewed a bunch of students. I have a bunch of data that I could have made up, but I didn't. And you can see there, I had folks that ranged in age from about 18 to 23. Most of the research that I did was conducted inside of a residence hall. I've got the semesters that they've known their roommates, the majority of them between 1 and 2 semesters. And then, you know, I tried to get a fairly even gender split, male and female, and then class standing. A lot of them freshmen and sophomore, because again, you're working inside of a residence hall. That's the population of students that you're going to find more often. It did have a couple of juniors, no seniors, unfortunately. So I recognize that's a blind spot in the research. And as I did this research, I also wanted to focus on how long they'd lived in a residence hall. Most of them were less than a year, but we had a fairly large number of folks that had stayed in the halls for 2 years, and even longer than that. So as I went through this research, I tried to find a decent sample size, and then I used qualitative methods to interview them about how they handled conflict. And what I found was some really interesting stuff. What I found was that really, when they talked about conflict, they talked about harmony. They talked about 2 different types of harmony, as I found specifically: engaged harmony and coexistent or avoidant harmony. So when we talk about conflict, and when I talk about conflict with students, I don't talk about it from a sense of how are we going to live all hunky-dory and perfect. I talk about it of how are we going to live in harmony. And as I poured through the 300 pages of notes that I had and the hundreds and hundreds of pages of transcripts from interviews, I found that there were 7 specific resources that students utilized in order to navigate through their conflicts. And what those resources allowed me to do was have much more pointed conversations with those students and cut through some of the stuff that they couldn't articulate. Because when I sat down in mediations, they knew that something was wrong, but they couldn't explain to us what it was. So at the end of my research, I was able to theoretically extend structuration, but also found some really awesome practical uses that I was able to employ not only with my RA staff, but with myself in my own mediations. So when we talk about, again, we're talking in the context of comfort. We're looking for harmony. There's engaged and coexistent harmony, and there's 7 resources. And when we talk about harmony, when we talk about engaged versus coexistent, I wanted to peel those apart a little bit. The folks that I found that were engaged harmony, those were folks that discussed issues. They were solution focused. They basically viewed conflict as something that's fixable. Conflict was something that they shouldn't be afraid of. They just needed to kind of tackle and get through it. The individuals that I found who utilized a coexistent harmony model, they internalized their issues. These are the students that you talk to in your mediations, and they say, I don't know, I'm just really laid back. Like nothing really ruffles my feathers. And the fact of the matter is, something could ruffle their feathers, but they're not going to be in a place where they really want to do anything about it, because at the end of the day, they view and they perceive conflict as something that is ignorable. It's something that they can just wait until it goes away. It's something that, regardless of how big the issue is, they don't really want to tackle it. They want to get through it. Again, they've got that fixed endpoint on the relationship. I got to make it through May and I'll be done. So my engaged folks, they were more proactive. They sat down with their roommates. These are the folks that do roommate contracts. These are the folks that come to their RAs, or they come to their friends and try to get advice and then go back and handle the problem on their own, because they really want to fix it. They want to get in there and try to diagnose the problem and repair the relationship. Versus my coexistent friends, again, they're not always taking a negative approach, but they're not being proactive. Conflict is something they can ignore. Conflict is something that happens that there's really no solution for. They're folks that see conflict as it's just going to take too much time. I can't really fix it. I'm just too laid back to handle it, or I'm just going to internalize this. I'm not really going to talk about it. So again, coexistent does not mean that it's a negative approach. And that's something that I found in a lot of the research that I did, was that engaged in coexistent is not putting a value judgment on them and saying that one is better than the other, or that one works, the results are more positive than the other. But I think the biggest difference is that when we talk about all those positive things that come from handling your own conflicts, my folks that were engaged reaped those rewards much more commonly than the folks who were coexistent, because the coexistent folks just didn't want to do anything about it. So while coexistent isn't negative, and I would never say that that's a bad way to run a relationship between a roommate or between a friend, I would say that they're missing out on some of the key benefits and components of handling a conflict appropriately and on their own. So again, engaged is not necessarily good, coexistent not necessarily bad. I think we know plenty of people who have divided a room right down the middle and said, that's your side, this is my side, and that's the way they functioned. I had a group of folks that lived in one of my buildings for 3 years, and that is the way they did it every year, and they got along just fine. They lived harmoniously. So that's the difference between engaged and coexistent. That, the engaged folks, typically, they want to fix things, and coexistent, they want to ignore it. And now I'm going to talk through a little bit more about the resources that created the idea of engaged and coexistent. Now, I want to draw your attention to the fact that both engaged and coexistent harmony pairs utilize these same resources. They just utilize them in a different way that reinforced the system that operated around their conflict. So again, that's how structuration comes into this, is that these resources are being utilized to help inform the social practice that then in turn allows them to understand how conflict operates in their relationship. So that's the systems approach, is that an engaged group of individuals are going to use resources a very specific way, and the way that they utilize those resources will inform the social practice, and by doing that, they reinforce those resources and how they are utilized. So it's very cyclical if you think back to that graph. Structuration is a huge theory. There's like 3 books on it. I'm scratching the surface here, but again, I want to make sure that this is something we can digest and utilize. So if you'll think back, there are 7 resources that I said I came across in the research that I did, and I've named them in regards to the type of behavior that I think they demonstrated. So the first resource I want to talk through is authority. And authority is basically the idea of who can help. So when we get into a situation where we are in a conflict, authority is the idea of how do we navigate ourselves out of this. An engaged pair who has engaged harmony existing in their relationship, that authority is internal. So somebody that is in that conflict can handle that conflict. These are the folks that will tell you that, yes, there's a problem, but I'll take care of it. What I found with the coexistent folks was that authority existed outside of their relationship, that the conflict could be mediated or could be handled, but it needed to be somebody else making the decision. These are the folks that go to the RA, they go to the graduate hall director, they go to the hall director, they go up the chain to try and find somebody with an answer, right? Because the authority to solve their problems doesn't exist in that space. This is also a great time to talk you through the idea that in a relationship between, let's just say 2 people, although conflicts can have more than 2, in a relationship between 2 people, you can have somebody who is engaged and somebody who is coexistent. And that makes for a really interesting conversation, because especially with authority, the engaged person could be saying, no, we can take care of this. Let's sit down and do it. And because of the social practice and system that the coexistent person is existing in, that person is going to tell them, yeah, we can do it. Let's sit down and do it. And the coexistent individual is going to say, no, we don't have the authority to take care of this. And in those environments, when you're dealing with coexistent folks, mediation is not a solution for them. They don't want to sit down and work out their problems together, or that one person doesn't want to sit down and work through the problem because the way that they are interpreting the conflict, they don't have the authority to do so. So authority provides, I think, a really great opportunity right from the onset to start the conversation with, why are you talking to me? Or why aren't you talking to one another? Which was a really frustrating question that I used to ask is, are you talking to each other? And they would say, oh, of course not. We need you to talk to them for us. And 9 times out of 10, it was because they saw the authority in the relationship operating this way. Basically, I was the one that could help. It wasn't them. And those were the mediations that were really, really complicated and oftentimes took the most time for me because I had to get through some of this stuff with them and get them to understand that either they could make a decision or I had to try and make a decision for them, but allow their input. The second resource is space. And space is a really fascinating resource because I think it's so very clear to like watch it operate. So space involves not only the physical room that we're in, but also the different pieces of furniture or things that are in that room, desks, beds, chairs, closet space, all that good stuff. So when we talk about space, we're talking about every sort of thing that could be considered space in that room. An engaged person thinks about space as shared, and a coexistent person thinks about it as segmented. And I know that some of those things might seem like they cross paths a little bit, but I'm going to hopefully illustrate how that works. So an engaged person sees the space as shared. It's our room. Everything in this room is ours, which means that it's no big deal if I come in and I put my book on your desk because the whole room is ours. The space is shared. You can put your stuff on my bed. I'm going to put stuff on your bed. There's no problem with that. Versus a coexistent individual who's going to look at that room as, yes, we both live in this room, and from that standpoint, the space is quote unquote shared. But as far as how we divvy things up, the space is very segmented. This desk is mine, even though it exists in our room, quote, our room. And the only reason it's our room is because the two of us live here. So this desk is mine. This bed is mine. I would never sit on your bed because of the way that I think about this space. And because of that, when you sit on my bed, that's why I get so upset about it. This really just blew the lid off of some of the conversations I was having with students around conflict because it finally made sense. It finally clicked as to why me putting my ramen in your part of the refrigerator, even though it's one refrigerator that we quote unquote share, but why me putting my ramen in the fridge after I've made it, because you don't refrigerate, box ramen. But it made me understand why that was such a big deal to one person and the other person could just be so ambivalent about it. Like, I don't care. It's whatever, it's shared. It's because the first person saw that space is segmented. There are very clear boundaries about what is mine and what is yours and where that exists. And the other person, it was shared. Everything was yours, mine, and ours. So that was fascinating to me. And it really helped me to articulate to those individuals in those conversations, like, let's talk a little bit about how you are perceiving space. Tell me about your bed. Is it your bed? Is it my bed? Tell me about the chairs in the room. Tell me about the floor. This is where you see individuals that put a line down the middle of the room and operate very, very easily that way. It's because they both see the room as segmented. And as long as they're on that understanding, they can live completely in harmony. So that's an example of someone that could have one aspect of a resource be a coexistent, but one aspect of it be engaged. So again, a really, really cool question to lead in your conflict mediations and in your conversations with students or in everyday life. Like, I've been married for 4 years, and there are some aspects of my apartment that, like, the space is very much segmented. You want to talk about bathroom space? It's very clear that there are spaces for my wife's stuff, there are spaces for my stuff, versus like in the kitchen or in the living room, that space is very much shared. It's no holds barred. So even in my own life, I've seen some of these operate. And again, the resources that we utilize, or the rules that we utilize to enact these resources, like little bins that are, in the bathroom that separate out where my stuff goes, where her stuff goes. Those rules, those things that we utilize, those routines help us to enact these resources that allow us to continually reinforce the social practice that in some aspects our lives, space is shared, in some aspects it's segmented. So again, space is a really, really cool, and you could play all day with it. The next one is a little more convoluted, but it makes sense if you do a little bit of thinking about it. So favor reciprocity. And this is all about when you think in a relationship with another person, when they do favors for you, this is all about how you perceive paying back, quote unquote, that favor. Basically, the question is, do you have to pay that favor back, or do you want to pay that favor back? And an engaged relationship, what I found and the way that the students would talk about favor reciprocity was that they wanted to meet that favor. So somebody would do something nice for them and they thought that was great. I want to return that favor. It's just a really nice thing to do. I want to meet them, you know, not to use an overused term, but I want to meet them where they're at. They did nice things for me. I should do nice things for them. And it was just a really, it was really honest and pure way to think about favors. It wasn't a competition. It was just, they did something nice for me. I should do something nice for them. Versus a coexistent group of individuals, which is like a beat. I want to beat you at being nice because I'm not going to be the bad roommate, right? I am not going to wear the crown of being the one that is callous or inconsiderate. So if you do a favor for me, I'm going to do a nicer favor for you. And then it becomes this weird cyclical competitive thing around favor reciprocity. So again, if you're finding that you're hitting and missing with your conversations, this is kind of an understated aspect of conflict that I think can be really illuminating in regards to the two individuals can be seeming like they're doing really nice things for one another, but if it's because they feel like they have to do those things, that doesn't always mean that the relationship is operating as smoothly as possible, especially if one person is just doing favors because they want to be nice and the other person sees them as trying to undercut them or trying to make them look bad, which is causing them to have to try and beat them. Right. So those are the first three resources, and I recognize I went through those very quickly. The thesis that I wrote on this is about 120 pages long, so there's tons and tons of other stuff that goes into it. But this is the Reader's Digest version, and I think allows us to cut through a lot of the theoretical stuff and get down to how do I use this in conversations. And also a disclaimer that these three things and the seven things, they're not separate items that operate independent of one another. They influence each other as they change. And I'll illustrate that here in a minute, but authority impacts space, space impacts authority, favor reciprocity, and all the way through. So you don't just have one operating, you've got multiples, but it doesn't mean you can't take one at a time. So moving to the next four resources, the next one is mutual respect, and this is another one that seems a little difficult to understand, but it kind of goes hand in hand with favor reciprocity, and this is the idea of folks that want to be the good one. And I think that if you've interacted with students in a conflict setting, that you've heard them say, well, I'm not the bad roommate, or, you know, I'm a good roommate. It's because we want to be good people to one another. I really do think at the heart of things. So when we talk about mutual respect in regards to an engaged relationship, an engaged harmony relationship, respect is something that we do, right? It's a collective act. Regardless of how many people are living in that space or how many people are in that relationship, respect is something that we have all agreed to do together and that we're all on the same page about. Versus a coexistent pair, they really articulated that mutual respect was something that I do, so you better do it too. And this really came out in a conversation I had with a young man whose parents came to visit. And his parents came to visit, and he recounted this story of he was sitting on his couch in his room, and his roommate's parents came in, and he popped up off the couch, and he shook their hands, and he said, "How you doing? I'm so-and-so. It's very nice to meet you." And they had a great conversation for about 3 to 5 minutes, and then the parents left. A couple weeks later, into town, and his roommate was sitting in the same spot on the couch, didn't get up, didn't say hello, didn't introduce himself. And really, I honestly think that it wasn't because he was intentionally trying to be rude. I think it's because this person just didn't think about it. But the way that person, the way that the individual whose parents came to visit, he was feeling kind of snuffed. He was like, well, I got up and introduced myself to your parents, so you better be respectful as well. Like, this is an exchange. I did it, so you do it too. Versus, the engaged pair, respect is just something that happens naturally, and they understand that it's something that we do together. So oftentimes when you talk about mutual respect, this is a place where it's because the roommates or the individuals in the relationship have not had a good conversation with each other. They haven't set those expectations. They haven't talked through what it means to respect one another. It's just that idea of like, well, I give respect, so I better get respect. And as we all know, that's not always the way that the world works. And sometimes those conversations are necessary. So mutual respect is a little harder to piece together and parse out, but it's a theme that kept coming up in my interviews in regards to how folks are supposed to respect one another. The next resource is routines, and this really guides the idea of what can we do and when can we do it. Excuse me for a second. So when we talk about what can we do and when can we do it, in an engaged harmony relationship, routines are collective. Again, there's something that we came up with together, or there's something that we came to understand together, and from time to time we have conversations about it. Versus a coexistent relationship, routines are individual. I really don't think that much about your routine. I got my own stuff going on. And to contextualize this in reality, this is where you see the individuals who come to your offices and say our schedules are just too different, or we have different bedtimes, or we have, the lights are on when I'm trying to sleep. Those types of things are the routines. It's the what can we do and when can we do it. They're always in the room playing video games and I'm trying to study. That's an idea of that person is articulating that I don't like what they are doing it, and further, I don't like what they are doing, but more importantly, I don't like when they are doing it. They haven't had a conversation around their routines. They haven't talked about the fact that from 2 to 5 p.m. we should be studying instead of goofing off. So when I talked to students who had engaged relationships, routines were things that they talked through or that they collectively understood, that just because I need to do something does not negate the fact that this person has their own stuff going on. It was a lot of consciousness and a lot of, I think, self-awareness that was displayed in those engaged harmony relationships. And it was a lot of consideration for the other person, knowing that we need to collectively understand and navigate how we work through our days together. The individual I talked to that were coexistent, these were the ones that they went to bed and the roommate would come in and flip on a light or play video games or whatever. And they never talked about that. They never talked about the fact that their routines were different, but they got into fights constantly and had conflicts around the idea of what can we do and when can we do it. And I think if they would have really cut through some of that peripheral stuff, I don't like that you play video games. I don't like that the lights are on. I don't like that you're making food at 2 in the morning. I don't like that you come in after you had a night out and wake me up. That's all the peripheral stuff. What they really need to be talking about is the routine. In that room, what can we do and when can we do it? And I think that there are some great examples of roommate contracts that are out there that answer some of these questions, but that's a really good question to ask if you're in a mediation. Have you all spent time discussing what your routines look like and how you can craft a routine that works for both of you rather than just 2 routines that exists in the same space? External others was probably the most convoluted resource that I found, but it was a theme that I couldn't quite get away from. It kept coming back. And basically it's the idea that communities teach. We all know that in a lot of my research, it was in residence halls of 600 students. That in and of itself is a macro community with individual micro communities that are a part of it. And in these instances, the engaged folks, the communities didn't solve the problems. So this takes it one level out. We've been talking a lot about the individual relationship and the conflict. This takes it one step further out to the larger community. And an engaged pair didn't have the communities solve their problems for them. They didn't mean they didn't use them to vent to, but at the end of the day, the communities pushed back on them and said that, you need to go solve this and you go talk to that person. Versus a coexistent harmony relationship, oftentimes they existed in larger systems where the communities validated their avoidance. They said things like, yeah, that really sucks, or they went and talked to the other person for them, or they tried to solve the problem without really addressing the individuals who were in the relationship. So you can see we can take this out further and further and further. You could get to the larger campus community and how that impacts and influences the way that they think about conflict. But this is just one example of that, of how the larger community impacted and pushed on the individuals that were in that room or in that space. Either they pushed back and said, no, go solve your own problems. Yes, I can listen to you. Or they said, yeah, that really sucks, and I'll go talk to them for you. Or maybe you should just move out. And in those examples, we saw different ways that they utilized this resource of community and external others. And finally, time. Time was the last resource that I found. And really, it just has to do with the way that those involved in the conflict think about the concept of time. Talked earlier in the talk about this being a relationship with a fixed endpoint. Engaged harmony pairs articulated the fact that their relationship with their roommate was a commitment. It was something they said, you know, we both were here for the whole year. A year's a really long time. We need to find a way to make this work. I've committed to this person. I'm going to try and stick this out. And this was, you know, great things to hear from young people that were saying things like, I really owe it to this person to try to give them the benefit of the doubt and work through our problems. A coexistent harmony pair looked at time as a countdown. You know, when you've got the engaged pair saying a year is a really long time and we need to figure out how to make this work, you've got your coexistent harmony pair saying a year's not that long and I can last until May without talking to this person. And this, above all things, is just a really cool question to ask. How do you think about the commitment that you made to this person? Or how do you think about the time that you're spent? Like, a year's a really long time. And if they come back and say a year's really not that long, and I think I can just last, that gives you a really great indication as how they're thinking about time and how they're thinking about how they're using it to inform the way that they look at conflict. So those are the 7 resources that I found. Again, authority, space, favor, reciprocity, mutual respect, routines, external others, and time. I want to give you a quick example of how they work sometimes together. So when we look at space and then we look at routines, what can we do and when can we do it? Routines can be heavily influenced by how we think of space. So if you've got some folks that look at the space as segmented, so again, you're looking at like, this is my desk, this is my side of the room, no part of your routine should impact what I'm doing on my side. That's where we start to see the idea that what can I do and when can I do it? If you are up in the middle of the night and I'm trying to sleep, shining into my part of the room, again, this is my side of the room. I should be able to sleep on it when I want to sleep on it. Nothing you do should be impacting my things. So because of that, I know that we're looking at space from a segmented standpoint, and that we're looking at routines as something that is individual. So again, you've got 2 coexistent tendencies to those 2 resources, but the routines are impacting the way they look at space, and space is impacting the way they're looking at routines. So again, you can see there's tons of different ways that these things can influence and impact one another. There's also another layer to structuration that I'm not going to get into that deals with norms and power and meaning and what words mean, but that's really neither here nor there. I want to get to some of the practical things that we talk through in regards to how to use this. So really at the end of the day, how does this work? How do we use these resources to help inform some of our practices professionally or just in everyday life, working with students as they are going through conflict? So basically, consciousness is a huge thing. There's an author that writes about structuration that says knowing enables doing. So just the fact that I know that a structure exists, I know the rules and resources that are helping to create that structure, enables me to do it. Now that change is very slow. We talked about again with the ducks how if I try to break out of that structure, the social practices are going to pull me back into it and have me they're going to have me conform back to that social system. So it's little steps, but just the fact that we know that it's happening can help us to change the structure and can also enable us to do structure better. I think something that I really took from a lot of this research is that colleges and universities need to get more serious about the way they do roommate matching. Questions like, do you smoke? Do you stay up late? Do you stay up early? Or do you get up early? I'm sorry. You know, those are great questions to ask somebody, but really they're very surface level. They don't get to the heart of where a conflict comes from. Yes, your stuff can smell like smoke, but that's an irritation. Why can't we start asking these students how they, or create questions to ask them how they think of space, or to ask them, you know, when you think about committing to a roommate relationship, what does that speak to you? Or ask them things like, What does it mean to you to be a good roommate? Now, granted, those questions are harder to navigate when we go to match roommates. It makes the process much more cumbersome. It makes it less easy to just put people in rooms. But I think at the end of the day, it will allow us to have more quality relationships from the questions that we're asking. So we either need to get better at doing that at the university level when we do the initial pairings, or we need to start having our staff in our buildings ask some more pointed questions that have some teeth on them about what they expect from a roommate pairing, or what they expect from the roommate that year. I also think this allows us to adjust our mediations. Again, I talked about great questions to ask in those mediations, and this allows us to do that. Start thinking about this from a systems approach. It's not necessarily about what you've done that it has personally offended or impacted me. Yes, that's important, but what is it about the way that you are viewing the system and viewing the structure that is causing you to behave that way, and asking them, tell me about the way you think about space. Tell me about the desk. Is it your desk? Is it a shared desk? Heck no, it's not a shared desk, it's my desk. Okay, that allows me to have a better idea of how to go about navigating through that mediation. Also, it allowed my RA staff, and has allowed staffs that I've worked with to have better entry points to those conversations, to get to the heart of things faster, rather than spending all our time talking about the fact that somebody used all your toilet paper. And then finally, training, I think, is a pretty self-explanatory practical implication that this can really improve the way that we do training in regards to conflict mediation. When I worked with RAs, we did conflict management mediation every single year. We did it for inter-staff conflicts, and we did it for resident conflicts. But when I started talking about it this way, I think it really empowered my staff to either ask those questions in their mediations, or to ask them individually, so that their residents could take those back to their conversations with their roommates. It allowed them to have different entry points, to think about it differently, and again, to stop focusing on the peripheral stuff that was getting in the way of them getting to the heart of those issues. So again, consciousness, roommate matching, adjusting mediations, and then training, I think, are the really big takeaways from this. So at this point, that was pretty quick. That was a whole lot. It was like 45 minutes, but that was a huge theory. There's a lot of information there, but I think it's a really great starting place, and has helped to improve the way that I think about conflict, not only in my own life, but in the way that I help people with conflict and talking with one another. And quite honestly, just makes it a little less scary. So with that, I'll take any questions that folks have, if they have any. I know there's a various number of ways that we're mediating and doing questions, but any that exist, I'd be happy to try and answer. Or you can, tweet at me there, and I'm pretty active on Twitter. So question: how would you advise people who want to look at building their knowledge or skill around helping roommate conflict? Oh, that's a great question. Such as new professionals, yeah. So I think a really easy way to answer this question is like a quick Google search. There's tons of great resources out there in regards to conflict and how we look at it. A lot of the work that I did came from reading for my thesis. Here are some of the resources that I utilized as I was writing. That Putnam article, 1987, it's old, but it's good. Putnam did a ton. She's like one of the founders of modern conflict research and management, and a lot of her work has informed the way that we think about conflict. So I would suggest looking at some of the articles that she wrote. Also, if you get the opportunity to look at any conflict communication coursework or writing, there's a lot of stuff with conflict that seems pretty self-explanatory, but it helps to be able to read it. So if you're looking at wanting to build your knowledge or skill, reading is a great place to start. There's tons of great articles on Essay Chat about conflict and how to work through it. I also think one of the best ways to do it, and something that I used to tell all of my students, was that just doing it really helps. You start to learn what are things that work, what are things that don't work, what are questions that I can ask folks that get me to a better place, and what are questions that are kind of non-starters. So when you get the chance to mediate a conflict or sit down with residents and talk through conflicts, that's a great way to learn about it as well. And the final thing that I will say is get a hold, if you have on your campus a copy of a roommate conflict or a roommate agreement, get a hold of a copy of that and review that, because that there's great information as to how typically your residents were perceiving conflict, or at least how the university thinks they are. Can you expand on roommate matching during the application process, perhaps? What are some additional questions people could use or ideas you have to match roommates and encourage communication before they arrive on campus? This is a great question. And I'm going to stop sharing this stuff. I can share it later if you need it again, but so social media is like the worst thing in the world when it comes to new roommates, because it allows them to get information about that person before they get information about that person. It allows you to make a quick snap judgment about somebody based on a profile or something they said or pictures that they've posted. So I think ways that you can get them on campus, or ways that you can get them talking to one another, that is not just reviewing, stalking you on Facebook or reviewing your Twitter feed, ways that you can get them actually engaging with one another. You're going to head off some of those preconceived notions and judgments that they make. I think the roommate matching thing is a beautiful idea on paper. And I've never worked in, I used to check roommate pairings by hand, and it was a lot of work, but I've never been part of like, I think a true roommate matching process. So I may be speaking a little out of turn when I say that we can improve that process, but I know that on the campus that I worked at, we asked very few questions that allowed the students to display any personality of their own. It was mostly questions just about their everyday life and how they lived. And that's great that you consider yourself a neat person, but what happens when mom and dad filled that out and they think that you're a neat person, or mom and dad don't think that you smoke, or mom and dad think that you go to bed early when really you just shut the door and stay up late? That happens all the time. And oftentimes I think it's tough for us to be honest with ourselves. So what are questions that we can start asking that allow those students to display a little bit of their personality? And one of those that I said was a great idea of, have you ever had to share a room before? How did that work for you? And again, I think this makes the process more cumbersome, which is why it's not being done, because you're getting into some more open-ended response questions. But have you ever had to share a room before? Tell me about that experience in 100 words. Talk to me a little bit about the commitment that you're going to make to your roommate. Talk to me, what are things that would make you want to move rooms? That allows you to get a really good gauge on what are the breaking points for a student who's coming into a new space. If they can articulate to me, I'm not going to leave this room no matter what, cool. But if they start to articulate, like, here are things that I think are breaking points for me, things like somebody putting their stuff on my desk, somebody using my stuff. I know that that's a resident that I'm probably going to want to have a touch point with fairly early when they get on campus. So I know that that's a really high level and theoretical answer to that question, but I just think the questions need to allow some more personality for the students to come out, not just how do you live a daily life and when does it start and do you smoke? You mentioned parents and families in conflicts. How would you engage these support systems during roommate conflict? That is great. Yeah, if parents call in for student concerns, my student roommate does blah, how would you approach that? Do you engage with parent or try to empower the student follow up? That's a great question, and something I dealt with often. And I think a lot of people deal with often is these parents that are just trying to do the best they can. They've heard horror stories from their student about their roommate, and they just want to make sure that somebody is there and can help. So oftentimes I started those conversations just by listening. Tell me about what you've heard. Tell me about what your student's been telling you. I let the parent explain to me what they've been told. I asked them, okay, how do you want me to move forward? And 9 times out of 10, when I had a really frustrated or stressed parent call me, a lot of times that initial listening and that initial just asking clarifying questions allowed them to settle down a little bit. And then the question of how do you want me to proceed is a really great starter for them, because that'll let you know what their expectations are. How do you want me to proceed? Well, I want you to get in there and I want you to discuss this with the roommate. Okay, that helps me understand what they're expecting of me. Or I've had parents say, I want my son or daughter to not know that I called, but I really just want someone to check up on them. That's great too, and that informs how I'm going to move forward from there. What I think is really important when parents call to not do is the very clear and obvious one, like don't take sides. And I think we all know that goes with a mediation as well. But another really important thing that that you can do with parents is help correct those perceptions. We talk a lot about perceptions, and parents can factor into that as well. I worked with one parent in particular who was like deep-seated in the conflict with the daughter who was having issues with a roommate. Like the parent was involved, which was strange. So I had to work a little bit to help correct some of those perceptions as far as like what I knew for a fact to be happening and what I didn't. By no means do I think you need to correct the parent. And I always started with, you know, sir, ma'am, person, I don't have kids, so I want to be able to help. But again, trying to, I think, figure out what the parent wants from you, but then also end the conversation by explaining what the parent can do to make your life and your ability to answer for that situation easier. So oftentimes I would end with, this may take me a couple of days to get my arms around. I just need you to be patient. I will call you with an update. Or you could tell the parent, I need you to tell your son, your daughter to come find me. So I think allow them to feel like they're part of the solution without letting them be part of the problem, if that makes sense. And that's very difficult and nuanced, and it's going to change from parent to parent. But again, my student's roommate does blank is a great entry point for a lot of those conversations, and being able to say, I think, how do you know they do blank? Have you seen them do blank? Not in an effort to correct them, and not in an effort to say, I think you're lying to me, but an effort to say, I want to make sure I get all the information. And oftentimes with new professionals, and I saw this happen a couple of times, that's uncomfortable to feel like you're questioning a parent. And that's uncomfortable to be on the other end of that phone or in person and make it and have it sound like you're saying, I don't believe you. So I want to make it clear that that's not what I'm advocating for, but what I am advocating for is making sure that you're working with all the information. And parents are just like our students. They want to make sure that they have the best experience possible, and they can be really protective. And I think recognizing, hey, I know that you're really worried about your student. I promise that we'll take care of it. But in order for me to do that, I need to make sure that I have all the information. And the final thing that I have told parents before who have been really, really adamant about calling me is I have just straight up told them, I understand you're worried and I understand you're concerned. I need you to let me talk to your student. Your student is the one that's having the issue. You may be paying the bills, and I recognize that. You may be really concerned. Your student is not in danger, and I need you to let me work with them. I can help correct this situation. One thing that you will find in those parent situations and in conflict in general, I often found that if your university or your school that you're working for, if their philosophy is there's a problem, just move them, a lot of the stuff I just talked through is not going to apply. And I used to tell my supervisors, I used to tell the folks that I worked with that the moment that we buckled and let that student just move, I lost the developmental moment. I lost that moment with that student to help them understand how to navigate a conflict. So I think some of this also needs to be couched in understand your institutional culture, understand what you do and don't do for students and for parents. If it's carte blanche, we move them no matter what, issue big or small, you're going to have less time and less flex room to do some of this talking and have some of these conversations. But if you know that you're going to get some support from folks above you and around you to have some of these conversations and maybe hold off the moving for a little while, I think it can really be helpful in allowing students to figure out how to manage their own problems. So I see that that's all the questions that we have. Which is great. So that's all the information that I have in regards to this. I'll put those resources up again if you want to see them. But if nothing else, I've really enjoyed this. I want to say thank you to NWACUHO for allowing me the time and opportunity to present this information. I found it really helpful. Hopefully you have too. And thank you to everyone that tuned in. I wish you the best of luck as you start your trainings and as you start your school years, and know that here in Oxford, Ohio, I'm rooting for all of you as a former housing professional, as a former campus professional. So thank you so much, and best of luck as you start your years.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was very insightful, and thank you for sharing your knowledge and research with us. And those 7 resources is definitely a start to think about roommate conflicts, and I think definitely a lot more to that. Just wanted to point out your Twitter handle. If you can share that again, that would be awesome. Sure.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and screen share it. It's Reachable Sauce, and there is a story behind that, but we don't have to get into that now. So there you have it. I'm pretty active on Twitter. I would welcome any questions or just opportunities to say hey.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris. Everyone else, have a good first Friday. Thank you for stopping by. Goodbye.